Whenever people ask me for travel tips in Germany where I live, or Europe in general, they always want to know the same thing. They want to know how to get off the tourist trek and travel off the beaten path. I've lived in Europe for 8 years, I'm now a German citizen, and I've had the good fortune to travel and run around the continent from the Munros of Scotland to the mountains of North Macedonia and just about everywhere in between. All by foot, bike, or public transit. So in this video, I'm going to share with you some of my top tips for finding those destinations off the beaten path and, how to actually get to them. Now my last tip is my absolute favorite, and I know that might seem like a gimmick to incentivize you to watch the whole thing, and I'll be honest with you, it is. It 100% is. But it did lead to some of my favorite travel memories, so do stick around and watch the whole thing, people. And in case we haven't met before, my name is Joe Bauer. I'm an American who's lived in Germany for 8 years, and like I said, I'm now a naturalized citizen, which gives me all of the benefits of EU citizenship and none of that typical German baggage of having to explain what my grandparents did in the 40s. They were part of the resistance! Sure they were, Hans. Sure they were. Now this is my first video in a new series of videos I'm gonna make, sharing my travel tips and how to do some of the traveling I've been so very fortunate to do in my life. So if you've seen any of my films, like my 2 films out of Kenya, or my series of films from Vietnam, Laos, and Bangkok, or even some of my stuff right out of my own backyard, I'm going to use these videos to share how you can have your own unique off-the-beaten-path adventures. And if you've got any specific questions, do leave a comment so I can help you out. I might even use it as a topic for a future video. Or if, you want to do this one-on-one, I do offer travel consultation to help you plan your trip. Alright, now enough of that. Let's get to it. First up, use Reddit. Now Reddit is a great tool for asking and getting answers to your travel questions. Almost any country will have its own Reddit, and there might even be a subreddit dedicated specifically to travel in that country. Now before you post any questions, I would do a little bit of research beforehand within the Reddit to see if anybody has already asked your question, because repeat questions are generally frowned upon. If you don't see it, then go ahead and post asking people for some of the best off-the-beaten-path destinations in that country, and I'm certain you're going to get tons of answers. You can even Google, for example, off-the-beaten-path France Reddit, and find some answers in other Reddits like this one on solo travel. Speaking of Google, you could also just Google off-the-beaten-path and fill in the blank. I feel like people have forgotten that blogs exist. It's not all TikToks and Reels, people. Blogs are still out there, and in my opinion, you're more likely to find local creators with thoughtful advice like Lindsay Tremuta, who's lived in Paris for years, has written books about it, has a podcast, and even a freaking newsletter. Quite literally a triple threat, or a mirepoix, if you will, of expertly crafted Parisian media. I was personally desperate to avoid the overly touristic sites during my first trip to Paris, so I bought a copy of her book, The New Paris, featuring various restaurants, pastry shops, coffee shops, and breweries that Parisians themselves would happily visit. In fact, I remember that one of the restaurants we visited because of the book actually only had a menu available in French, which I presumed was as good an indicator as any that tourists don't usually make it over there. That, or something about the way I carried myself, simply exuded French sophistication. Yeah, probably not. So trust those local creators and be wary of anyone posting about off-the-beaten-path destinations in a country that the creator doesn't actually live in. I'm not saying people can't visit a country and get a good grasp on some of the off-the-beaten-path destinations. They can. But speaking as someone who makes things, I know that the pressure to feed the beast is very much real. So some people will go on a trip and turn their content into a reel of off-the-beaten-path destinations and wherever they just visited, mainly because they know it's information people want. But they might not necessarily have the best information if they were just on a week-long vacation. So be a little discerning of your source. My next tip admittedly won't be possible for everyone, but I'm gonna share it because it worked for us. This past May, my wife Melanie and I spent the entire month in Coliving, Spain, a beach town about an hour north of Barcelona. We were living and working at this new co-living spot called Coliving. If you're interested in learning more about that, I have an entire documentary all about it on my channel. Because we were based in this small town for a month, we were able to visit all these other little towns and villages nearby, like Mataró, Vilassar de Mar, and Sant Pol de Mar. A lot of Mars, come to think of it. Not to mention, we had plenty of time to get up into the hills and mountains right there in Coliving, where there wasn't really ever another tourist in sight. So that's the tip. If you work remotely and have the flexibility to do a little slow travel, base yourself in one place instead of moving around constantly and take day trips to the towns nearby. By sitting still in one place, you can meet some locals and ask them where they recommend traveling. It'll open up a ton of possibilities if you can be a little bit more spontaneous about it. That's how we found this lovely little hike from San Pol de Mar to Calais, por ejemplo. On that note, co-living like what we did with Colima is another great way to travel off the beaten path. But not just for wherever it is you're doing the co-living. Inevitably, you're going to meet people from all over the world and stay connected on social media. Those are instant, obvious contacts to reach out to if you ever happen to travel to where they're from. And even if they are from a relatively touristy city, they can still recommend off the beaten path destinations nearby and maybe even show you around to some of the local spots in town. Now, before I share my favorite way to travel off the beaten path, I want to talk a little bit about how to actually physically reach these destinations off the tourist trek, because it doesn't matter how interesting and unique they are if you can't actually get to them. Some places might actually be pretty easy. I've traveled in Eastern Europe to places with very few international tourists, but they still had rail or other means of public transit, so it was actually pretty easy to get around. Remember, off the beaten path is relative. Your hidden gem is someone else's regular hangout. But on that note of public transit, the further off the tourist trek you go, the more difficult it might be to find accurate information on buses and trains. Google Maps is sometimes a good source, but I always check and double check with Rome to Rio. This is absolutely my go-to site for any and all tricky travel transit needs. I don't know why, but sometimes Google Maps just doesn't have all the information. For example, with my recent trip to North Macedonia, I needed to get from the capital Skopje to Bitola for the race. On Google Maps, it looks like an absolute nightmare. But on Rome to Rio, I found a direct train and then a bus to Ohrid to take after the race. But probably the best option is to just actually find and download any local transit apps associated with the region. Another example. When I was in Wales, I needed to go from Brecon to Cardiff. Google Maps gave me options with transfers, and I couldn't really find anything much better on Rome to Rio. But when I was out on a run, I noticed a little bus terminal in Brecon, and when I got back to my hotel, I looked into routes with that bus company and found a direct bus to Cardiff. Easy peasy. Sometimes private bus companies don't show up on Google Maps, so that's where Rome to Rio or downloading local transit apps especially come in handy. Just don't forget, whether you're looking on Google Maps or Rome to Rio, make sure to use the actual date and time that you're traveling. Now, I know that sounds a bit like, have you checked your spam folder kind of advice, but I've worked with people who swore there was no transit option because they were looking, for example, during the evening in the US when it'd be the middle of the night in Europe. So, just keep the times in mind. All right, finally, my favorite tip for traveling off the beaten path, and this is one I've used time and time again in my own travels: heritage travel. Early on in my Dusseldorf days, I did 23andMe and went down a genealogy rabbit hole. Also, for wildly obvious reasons, it's kind of hard not to think about Jewish heritage when you live in Germany. Because of heritage travel, I've traveled to places I never even heard of until I researched my family history, and I ended up forming some of my favorite travel memories, like when I visited Bardy of Slovakia and toured the region with a local who's made it his personal mission to help refurbish the local synagogue. Or in Siget, Romania, where I walked the streets where my great-grandmother grew up. I was even invited to cook at a Jewish food workshop at the Elie Wiesel Memorial House. I don't want to brag, but quite possibly the best batch of kasha varnishkas that town's seen in 70 some odd years. Now, this caused a domino effect of sorts for more off the beaten path travel, because I also crossed the border on foot to Solotvino, Ukraine, where my great-great-grandparents apparently lived. And then I took an old overnight train from Siget to Bucharest. In both Bardejov and Siget, I was almost always the only foreign tourist around, which for some travelers is basically the dream. I also used heritage travel to find distant cousins in places like Vilnius, Lithuania, and Prague. Now, obviously, neither Vilnius nor Prague are off the beaten path in the popularized sense, but by having a local connection, I was able to see those cities through their eyes and get a unique perspective that most tourists will never have. So do some digging into your family history, and you might also end up with a list of destinations to visit you've never heard of as well. And I promise you that those memories are going to be far more meaningful than, say, being the billionth visitor to the Eiffel Tower. Alright, sports fans, I hope that was helpful. If so, please like and subscribe, all the usual YouTube stuff. And if you've got more questions, let me know in the comments. In the meantime, if you want to see what that off the beaten path trip to Siget looked like, you can watch it right over here in the magical box hovering over my shoulder.